And I'm Eleni Basti, I'm the director of the International Studies Institute. And just like many of you, I had the pleasure of listening to Dr. Ciddi's lecture in the morning on ISIS, Syria, Turkey, and that very, very complex picture in the Middle East that really affects everyone. And this afternoon we will hear a second lecture that he graciously agreed to present on women and minorities, and that will be introduced in more detail by my colleague and friend, Amina Wassel. But before we start, I would like to thank again our other colleagues here and beyond the university who helped make this visit possible, and that includes the National Security Studies Program at UNM and Frank Gilfeather, who are co-sponsoring this, as well as the Colorado European Union Center for Excellence and the European Union Commission. The Colorado group is now out of the University of Denver, and they have supported events that deal with the European Union and in its broader context, Turkey being a candidate state, of course. And last but not least, around students of the Turkish Student Association and the president of the group, Sabahattin, who worked tirelessly through the bureaucracy that we have at UNM. I will not call it Byzantine, but we could. I'm Greek, I can say that. And made this happen. And also I would like to welcome again Dr. Ciddi's mother, who is visiting from Istanbul. Oh, yes.
Welcome everyone, good afternoon. It's an honor to introduce Dr. Sinan Ciddi. The title of the lecture will be Minorities, Women, and Democratization in Turkey. Dr. Ciddi is an expert on Turkish domestic politics and foreign policy. He obtained his Ph.D. from SOAS, the School of Oriental and African Studies, University of London in 2007. And between 2008 and 2011, he established the Turkish Studies program at the University of Florida's Center for European Studies. He also serves as the executive director of the Institute of Turkish Studies at Georgetown University School of Public Service. So, without further ado, Dr. Ciddi.
Wow, thank you for getting me out here. And I see some familiar faces from the previous talk, so wow, you've given up your time to hear me babble on for another 45 minutes. I appreciate that. And there's a curious minority of boys here, which is actually quite a good thing, I guess. This is something somewhat intimidating for the male species taking this class, but wonderful. I don't feel qualified enough to talk about gender issues in Turkey as standing in front of a man, but I will do as my best. Except at least we can try and I can put an academic hat on it and discuss the perspective of women's rights and the gender politics in Turkey as it's matured. But I do have to stress, this is less of an academic area that I focus on, so you're not hearing it from the best person. I do have fabulous colleagues that do phenomenal work on this. But hopefully I might be able to address some issues and bring forward some themes which you might be interested to ask questions on following my spiel. So this is until 2:15, this class? Okay, so we'll do what we did last time, if that's okay. Oh, 3:15, I'm sorry. Okay, the clock's off, sorry. Okay. So we have, wow, I was going to say, you got 2 hours, you better get some refreshments, yeah. Well, my class in Georgetown, that's a 2.5-hour class. I think how they put up with that. They get a bit of a break, but not that much. So, I mean, I'm not sure how much you've covered on Turkey per se relating to gender politics in the Middle East. I mean, I'm sure it comes up as at least a week's topic, I'm sure. If that's true or not, I'm not. Or you just covered it in more broad thematic brushstrokes. But I'm going to try and do a couple of things here, 2 or 3 things. One is very much look at the progression of the issue of rights in Turkey. The culture of rights as enshrined in citizens' rights, how they became into formation basically from the transition from the Ottoman Empire into modern Turkey following 1923. And then I'm going to sort of concentrate on 2 basic cases, basically gender politics in terms of the evolution and the status of gender issues in Turkey's politics and how political parties basically relate to that, and the status of women in Turkey, particularly in the last decade, mainly because Turkey's been governed by one particular political party in Turkey, which initially took a very strong stance on not just women's issues, but a broader, a variety of what they refer to as minority issues in Turkey. And women by no means a minority in Turkey, but something else to touch on. But they did take a very strong stance in this at the beginning of their government, but it seems to have been a pronounced retrogression and decline in the status, both the legal status of women in Turkey, plus the social and cultural status as to where they'd like to be positioned by the incumbents. And the second case I'm going to look at is the issue of Turkey's Kurds, the single biggest internationalized minority issue that Turkey is quite as quintessentially sort of tagged with and basically presented with. And within that movement itself is a very interesting anthropologists, sociologists. There's fascinating study on the role of women in Kurdish activism in Turkey, if you're interested in this sort of thing. And hopefully I'll be able to touch upon some of that and then elicit some questions at the end. Okay, so the modern Republic of Turkey that I was born in, and what you come to know as the Near East, or the small country which is basically a landmass of the size of Texas today, which by European standards is what we would refer to as a big state. But here I guess it's just a run-of-the-mill sort of territorial sort of mass that we have. But Turkey is somewhat of a big country with a population of about 77 million, approximately half of which are women. And Turkey, unlike many other West European countries, or even to its immediate north, the Russian Federation, Turkey has a positive birth rate, which means that Turks are breeding, and then which that means in which case you have a net contribution of social mobility and climbing up of the sexes into occupational areas which are presently underutilized and understaffed. Okay. Turkey as a modern republic came into being in 1923. Before then, before the end of the First World War, we came to know it as basically the Ottoman Empire. And forget the status of women in the Ottoman Empire as individual citizens. Nobody in the Ottoman Empire was a citizen. Everyone was subject of the Sultanate. So just from that, you might be able to deduce notions of individuality, subjecthood, citizenship, what you had in terms of access to, in terms of rights as an individual under the Ottoman Empire, which were significantly restricted and kept at bay. Quite distinct, apart from the Muslim majority of the Ottoman Empire, the subjects of the religious minorities in the Ottoman Empire, what we refer to as the foreign millets, as in the Greek population of the Ottoman Empire, the Jews, the Genoese, the Italians, any non-Muslim entity within the Ottoman Empire very much had, at least in the last 100 years of the empire's existence, had basic autonomy in terms of personal, individual, and cultural rights. So individuality and status as a person within the Ottoman Empire very much depended on which sect you belonged to. Whether you were a Muslim majority member of society, which then meant you came under the entire cultural edifice of the Ottoman administration itself, as opposed to if you're a Greek Orthodox person, right, or an Armenian Orthodox person, whereby then your notions of subjecthood, whether you had access to education, women's rights or individual rights within that, very much depended on the rulership of your own autonomous entity within the Ottoman Empire. So those are two very different, that's a very different mode of existence. When the empire ended summarily at the end of World War I and the modern Turkish Republic was established, what we see is a total dumping of the old rules of the game. The biggest transition that we see in from the Ottoman state to the Turkish state is the transition from subjecthood to citizenship. And Turkey's basic experiment with democracy, as it begins in the 1920s, up until the recent period, is an experiment in modernity and modernization. Okay, the Turkey's modern republic's founding elite and the country's first president, which spearheaded a new dawn, let's say, for the country, turned it into what I would call, at least on paper, but also to a large extent in practice, one of the most progressive and legal states that typified anywhere on the Near Eastern or even European continent. Between the mid-1920s to the mid-1930s, Turkey's state institutions very much drove forward the process of social engineering and the creation and embodiment of the creation of a modern nation state. So if you want to look at it from sort of theoretical aspects and sort of conceptual aspects, Turkey's founding elite, led by a man named Mustafa Kemal, or he goes by the acronym Ataturk, which means father of the Turks. Okay, he basically spearheaded a modernization project which would have basically made Turkey, or intended Turkey to be a mirror image of a West European state. Quite possibly the image he had in his head, based on his biographical information, is the French Republic. In fact, if you look at Turkey's bureaucracy, the way state institutions and agencies have been built, there is a very close similarity. In fact, our state and government institutions are completely understood by our French counterparts, because our state organization system, in the way that the courts are organized, in the way that the legal edicts relating to the penal code or civil law, all this sort of stuff is a direct mirror image of the French system. Even the sort of administrative and bureaucratic system of Turkey very much mirrors this French system. So Mustafa Kemal, or Ataturk's image in his head, was the intended idea was to create a modern nation state which resembled its European counterparts. And there was there were a variety of reasons for this, mainly because Turkey began a long process of secularization that went back to the early 19th century. So Mustafa Kemal is often credited with building a modern republic that's sort of modeled on West European counterparts himself. But what you have to know, and what you have to realize and bear in mind, is Mustafa Kemal is a product of a long process of secularization, which basically took hold of the empire, the Ottoman Empire, its structures, its institutions, its bureaucracy, way before Mustafa Kemal was born. And when Kemal was born, he went to a military academy. He's a soldier. He trained as a staff officer. He was a smart man. He was an intelligent man. He spoke at least 3 languages. If you ever go to Ankara and go to his mausoleum, visit the museum where you'll see his personal library, which is a virtual mirror copy of Jefferson's library, in the sense that he's a product of the Enlightenment, or late Enlightenment in the Turkish case. But a lot of these sort of interesting state heads, leaders, he wasn't Jefferson's contemporary, obviously, but the manner in which they were educated is very sort of similar in a lot of respect. They studied the natural sciences. In the case of Ataturk, he then went on to study the positive sciences, military tactics, mathematics, and languages. So part of it comes from wanting to create a Turkey which mirrors the West, because that's what he's essentially brought up to believe in. That's essentially the modernization waves that the Ottoman Empire was subjected to at the end of the 19th century, produced elites such as Ataturk himself. And when he was in a position of power, which he seized at the end of World War I, he had a unique opportunity to implement what he thought was the most stable and realistic way for Turkey to go forward as a nation state. Because in his mind, it wasn't just, oh, let's create a state so we can mirror what the West looks like. And that's an unfair, I would say, an unfair accusation to place against him. In the case of Turkey and Turkey's elites at the time, who were all descended directly from the Ottoman institutions, it's the mindset in which these guys grew up in. They figured out that the age of empires, as Hobsbawm talks about, in his wonderful book, by the early 20th century, Ataturk was well convinced that there was no need to continue the pretense of an empire in any shape or form, because the next successful wave of states weren't going to be empires, but actually small states in a more, what was hoped and intended to be a more stable European map, which meant in his mind that Turkey's entire population had to be overhauled and educated. So the Turkey that he took over in 1923, a population of about 20 million people, 90% of which was illiterate, okay, virtually no industry to speak of, no middle class, 99% religiously homogeneous after a number of population exchanges at the founding of the Republic, where Turkey basically got rid of all its minority populations. So if you ask the question of Mustafa Kemal, well, how are you going to be a successful modern state, given these factors where you have no industry, virtually no schools to speak of, 90% illiterate and uneducated population, what is the solution? And the solution is basically a very inward-looking country whereby every factor was motivated to raise individual people to the highest potential that they have as individuals. Again, a transfer from subjecthood to citizenship, raise citizens. And one of the most interesting components of this is with citizenship comes legal status for everybody at the same level, right? There's no, the early republic establishes a fact. A new civil code in 1927 is enacted, which is a direct mirror copy at that time of the Swiss civil code, which basically gives equal rights and status to all citizens, regardless of religion, race, sex, whatever. No distinction made. So Turkey actually gives, Turkey is actually one of the first countries to allow women, well, not women, but it's universal suffrage, 1934, which is not late by standards, given that Switzerland only introduced women's voting rights in 1972. So that's an often quoted statistic for Turks. But the education policies enacted by the Kemalist or Ataturk's regime in the early 1920s and 1930s concentrated on two things. Firstly, children, and secondly, adults. So what you see is a massive pronouncement of education policies for adults, both rural and both urban areas, where everybody is essentially given the opportunity and pushed to exceed to the maximum of their individual potential, because Ataturk is interested in creating a middle-class society. You want educated people which can then get jobs in newly forming industries. These new industries can then basically start to build a national economy, wealth, accumulation of wealth, passage of wealth from one generation to the next, social mobility. And that's the only way Ataturk assumed that Turkey would be able to remain an independent and stable state in a sea and club of nation states all around it. Okay, so it's a very progressive move. So what you see overnight in a number of years is, particularly with respect to women, for example, the Civil Code of 1927 immediately abolished notions of polygamy. What else did they do? I've got voting rights, as we did, equality, full equality before the law. Civil marriages now take the precedent over religious marriages. These, marriages had to be proved by courts. And what you're seeing is, this is also very interesting to know about Turkey and the growth of rights. The Turkish state and the growth of the rights movement in Turkey is a movement which is a rights-giving state. It's not Turkey is not an entity in many European countries where the left wing of political parties was strong, or the suffragette movement in the UK, for example, when it began demanding and grabbing and taking rights. Turkey was very much a case whereby rights were granted and given and disseminated by the state. And this is very, very sort of, Turkey is by no means unique in this. It's not the only state that has done this, but very much, it's not by citizen demand, but it's dissemination by the state. There was no massive women's movement to actually demand the vote or equal rights. This was something that was enacted by the state from the top down, as were all social rights. Until the 1960s in Turkey, there were no labor rights, collective strikes, lockout agreements, workers' rights, working hours essentially. Unionization was banned. The 1961 constitution that Turkey enacted subsequently in the years to come is basically what introduces rights and creates the welfare state, the social safety net in Turkey. Retirement benefits, social security, the equivalent of, right to education, right to housing, right to employment, because the state and its elites felt that it was time, or it was necessary, for these rights to be disseminated, because it was afraid of basically development of notions of left-wing ideology as propagated by Marxist ideology in the immediate vicinity of Turkey's neighborhood by the Soviet Union. And to also stem the tide of the growth of left-wing ideology in the 1960s, which Turkey, again, was not a state alone in experiencing, but the state was afraid of movements such as Paris in the 1960s, growth of strong left-wing politics. Turkey wanted to very much stem the tide. So what you're looking at is a rights-giving state, okay? And in that sense, on paper, and to a certain extent in practice, Turkey is a progressive state. And it was particularly when it came to equal treatment of citizens regardless of their gender. And what you're looking at is a process that went even further than this by the late 80s and early 1990s for one simple factor. And this is almost unique in the Muslim world. It's not almost, it is unique in what we would call the EU factor, the Europeanization factor. Joining the European Union or seeking to join the European Union requires compliance with EU structures, laws, and practices enshrined in those laws. It's not just good enough to implement just enact the legislation, but the state actually has to practice that legislation. And in the body of European laws, commonly referred to as the acquis communautaire, there is a whole provision of entitlements and rights that goes down to the level of sexes, right? The EU's pull factor and Turkey's proposed and protracted and very long, drawn-out accession process was another driving factor that complemented the initial Kemalist or Ataturk's reforms of the early 1920s and 1930s. And hence, while Turkey still hasn't really gotten to grabs with granting legal status to LGBTQ, okay, nevertheless has had to consider and start dealing with this. So in urban areas such as Istanbul, Ankara, or Izmir, some of Turkey's biggest cities, that's where the larger LGBTQ communities exist and thrive. It's not the United States, but it's not Riyadh. So Turkey becomes somewhat of a hybrid entity, a very sort of unrecognizable entity when you look at the status of minorities, the status of women in Turkish society, in terms of what it means to be women. The Kemalist reforms produced some interesting results throughout the decade. Turkey has, which is a weird statistic, you'd probably like this, Turkey has the highest proportion of math professors in society in the whole of the European Union. Employment in academia by women in Turkey is very high. Also, same in the courts, the judiciary. Women judges are about the same number as male judges. There's a lot of them. I remember our divorce lawyer for my divorce judge for my mum's divorce. She was very hard on my dad by implementing the law. But this giving of rights, as we'll see, also has a drawback and two sort of levels. One is there's a rural-urban divide in Turkey. Okay. The reforms I'm talking about exist on paper. It's legal. It's the law of the land. Okay. But practice of people and individuals in Turkey is very, very different to this, as we'll see in a second. Okay. So the dissemination of the process of modernity and modernization and Kemalist reforms that we've talked about, okay, was most implemented and known about, which is critical, actual conscious knowledge of this by individuals of what their rights are in Turkey's urban areas. So growing up as a citizen in Istanbul or Ankara or Izmir or some other big cities, if you were a woman seeking to get divorced because you were not happy in your marriage, that's one thing. You know that you have the right to go and get a lawyer if you want, probably recommended, file and petition for a divorce, have the judge hear that out, argue, etc. Versus if you live in, for example, Diyarbakir, which is in the southeast of Turkey, heavily populated by Turkey's Kurdish minority, but it doesn't have to be Diyarbakir. It can be, let's say, Urfa, right? And, another big city in Turkey's east, where, traditionally women filing for divorce, there's a lot of documented cases of the husband actually taking the life of his wife who proposes to divorce him. And this is not an uncommon story even today. So there is this applicability divide, urban, rural. It depends where you live, because women who've grown up and have been educated in Turkey's big cities, especially in the western part of the country, they're more self-aware, they're more educated, they're more independent, they're more likely to have careers, they're more likely to be individualistic in pursuing what they can deem to be a happy life. And if they're not happy in that situation, then they take matters into their own hands, if they should do so. And divorce rates in Turkey, by the way, are as high as anywhere else, except the United States. But we're talking more about the European Union. The European average. So, yes, the urban-rural divide and awareness. That's so. The second thing to note about that is, as a result of that, is unequal access. Okay. In Istanbul or Ankara or the big cities that we've talked about, it's very easy to basically go and find an avenue. Today, it's much, much easier if you are afraid of domestic violence, right? Either before you petition divorce, or even if you don't want to petition for divorce, just domestic violence from your significant other. There are women's shelters, there are NGOs, there are civil society organizations which take cause with this. There are very interesting ones that will actually take you in and advise women about their rights, provide them temporary or even permanent shelter, legal representation, all of these above things. But if you live in rural parts of the country, there is now a growing awareness by women's organizations and civil society organizations which disseminate knowledge. One particular one, for example, which advocates and empowers women to run for political office, so they can hold political appointments in parliament or local councils, but also they get involved in women's education of women's rights. Should they be experiencing discrimination in the workplace? Should they be experiencing problems at home, significant others? But again, equal access is not guaranteed across the whole landmass of Turkey. It depends very much where you live and what your background is. So what we're looking at is the last 10 years has been very turbulent for Turkey in a great number of aspects. I mean, we could talk about this till the cows come home. The Justice and Development Party in Turkey, which took power in 2002, is a very interesting political movement, unlike anything that Turkey has hitherto experienced as a political government. Turkey's Justice and Development Party, I'll use its Turkish acronym, the AKP. The AKP came to power with a lot of promises, as all political parties do. But what it differentiates them from other previous governments, and it's quite unlike Turkey before, is that it's part of Turkey's Islamist movement. Right? And there, immediately, alarm bells started ringing in Turkey's secular mindset. Are we now going to go down the road of disestablishment of Turkey's secular sort of establishment? This is a question that's still being asked, and this is something that's still being thought about and talked about. First off, very interesting thing to know about the AKP as a political party. Its leader, Tayyip Erdogan, or just we'll call him Erdogan from henceforth. We don't give him the dignity of a first name right now. We'll call him Erdogan. And Erdogan's basic pull with a lot of voters in the last 10 years or more, right, is that they claim to be the party of the downtrodden, right? And this includes ethnic minorities in Turkey, the Kurds. They even mention women in their charter, you know, the role of women in Turkish society. Full homage paid to the establishment of secularism and women's rights and women's continued legal status as equal citizens. I don't know why they felt the need to reiterate that in their political charter, maybe because people were skeptical about it initially. But anyway, you know, but they not only wanted to, they said they not only wanted to maintain all this, but they wanted to augment all of that. The only thing that doesn't get mentioned in that charter, which I've looked at, is the status of LGBTQ individuals in Turkey. And the only way I can surmise about why that wasn't included in the political charter is because Turkey is still a country that doesn't feel entirely comfortable in terms of considering those individuals as equal citizens amongst the body of citizens itself, that should be entitled to a full body of rights. Even here, we're only starting to get comfortable with the idea of equal rights in terms of inheritance, property rights, the ability to adopt children. This is even very new in the US, let alone the European Union. Turkey, in my opinion, is woefully behind on this. But nevertheless, LGBTQ is not even mentioned in the AKP's charter. And the most headline expression that the AKP stood for augmented women's rights, right, was the issue of the headscarf, the hijab in Turkey. Turkey's secular establishment, its schools, its judiciary, the Ataturk system that was established and inaugurated in the 1920s and 1930s is very much, this is one area where the French and Turkish state overlap entirely up until recently, whereby headscarves were banned in public office. So universities such as this, girls or women were not allowed to attend classes wearing headscarves up until 2010. In fact, the law of the land stated that if I was the instructor of this class, and I've been in this situation, if I was in this class in Turkey and a student attended wearing a headscarf, legally, it's my responsibility to ask them to remove it. If they do not, I have to ask them to leave the class. And if I don't, and another student takes offense at me not taking action, they can they can go and petition the courts, and a prosecutor can file a lawsuit against me. I can have administrative proceedings against me. That's rigid institutional secularism, which actually is a derivative of the French system. And that was enacted until 2010. And the AKP came to power saying, we're going to augment women's rights basically by removing the headscarf ban. So that was a sort of headline voter issue for them. And if you think, I don't have a percentage of how many of Turkey's women cover, but it's a significant amount, okay? And this was a very sort of headline issue, campaign issue for the AKP that they succeeded on building on. The AKP was also popular amongst conservative supporters, women supporters in Turkey's Kurdish southeastern provinces. And that's a very sort of other sort of big vote bank for the AKP. They not only appeal to sort of non-Kurdish women in different parts of the country, but they also appealed to ethnic minorities and ethnic minority women who were conservative, religiously inclined in Turkey's southeastern provinces. After the Kurdish parties, the AKP or its derivative parties prior to that is the single most popular political movement in ethnically populous southeastern Turkey, up until recently anyway. So Erdogan's message on the social level was saying we're not only going to protect rights as we've hitherto had, but we're going to knock down ever-increasing barriers. Barriers against the headscarf, barriers against people who would like to lead a devout form of life. Now, what has happened since then is what I would say, some people are questioning, well, well, I'll leave that to a second to ask the question. What's happened to that is essentially a big disappointment, a letdown for a lot. If you go and have conversations with women's NGOs, political empowerment, civil society organizations, people who are very much involved in day-to-day advocacy for women's issues in Turkey, they'll say to you, well, we were kind of hopeful, if not a little suspicious, up until about the mid-2000s. But since then, it's completely gone the other way. It's a huge letdown. Okay, so the headscarf ban has been removed, sort of. It's a legally dubious issue. It required certain changes in the law, which were then subsequently put out. But then legal jurists said, well, that's fine, but they actually do not conform to constitutional norms that guarantee and mandate secular institutions. So what you had was some universities in Turkey absolutely removing the headscarf ban and students piling in, and then other universities which resisted, not because they were, I would say, intolerant or non-accepting, but the administrators of the universities were worried that if they acted one particular way, they were afraid of getting sued and prosecuted individually by the state down the line. That tends to happen to you in Turkey. Your follies, if you're a civil servant, you better be careful what you sign and what you implement for fear of what comes after in a few years' time in terms of political retribution. But don't worry about that. That's an interesting thing. But broadly speaking, now there is virtually no university or public office in Turkey that does not allow the wearing of headscarf. So you'll see in hospitals, in state hospitals, covered nurses and doctors working. You'll see schools, teachers wearing headscarves or whatever. Same with courts. So there's almost no sort of entity of this left. But the status of women under Erdogan's rule, people are asking, well, has arguably started this long process of decline. So, and people say, well, what happened? What do we mean by that? Well, Erdogan has done certain things, certain policies. First of all, the Ministry of Women and Family. So there was a cabinet position for women in Turkey. That cabinet position has now been downgraded to the Ministry of Family. Right? And that's very interesting in itself. Because the Ministry of Family, removing the women's issue out, should speak volumes to what comes afterwards. It's exclusively advocating, and this is not a position on my part, but just from the Turkish perspective. The perspective of abortion in Turkey was not a divisive issue. Turkey has abortion rights that fall broadly in line with the European Union laws and rules, which is basically the right to abortion that essentially we have in this country in terms of a certain number of weeks, and women are allowed to go to clinics or hospitals to have a legally mandated abortion. The government started explicitly advocating against abortion, or almost moving to the realm of banning it, which it then stopped short of doing because there was so much resistance in the public. Like I said, abortion in Turkey is not a divisive issue, as it is here. In Turkey, there was a lot of movement against it, saying, why are you getting rid of rights that we already have in place? And a lot of this came not necessarily from uncovered secular women, but also from very religiously devout women in Turkey who also protested against the proposed legislation itself. So Erdogan very much exclusively came out personally saying abortion should be banned. Secondly, he wanted to ban, unless the doctor deemed it a medical emergency, C-section births. Doesn't stop there. The next things that women have been battling with is the state now gives material incentives for women who leave their jobs and decide to stay at home and rear children. So Erdogan's always been claiming since the early 2000s that every woman in Turkey should give at least birth to at least three children. That it's the responsibility of everyone to start a family. And there are marriage incentives provided to individuals needing to be that wish to be married. Whether it's tax breaks to get married, state subsidies to get married, civil marriage union is no longer a requirement. You can get a religious one if you would like. First child, you get the equivalent of about the woman, if she decides to stay at home, the mother. For the first child, she'll be paid $100 a month by the state. The second child, an additional 100. And the third, you get an extra 100. So about $300 in total US money equivalent for having 3 children if you should so desire to have that. The education law of the country has been changed to a new comprehensive system which does mandate compulsory education up to 8 years, with the exception of individuals or girls who decide to get married. And since the implementation of that law about 4 years ago, there is a visible sign and drop of girls in education that desire to continue to higher education. It's an education policy designed to get women out of the education or higher education process. One civil society called the Status Women under the AKP has been reducing women to incubators for Erdogan's proposed population growth policies. And unfortunately, there has been a considerable growth in tolerance and reduction of prison sentences and punitive sentences for individuals convicted of rape, incest, and child abuse and domestic violence. In fact, actually, rape within marriage was not even actually recognized in law up until about 2007, 2008. And even still, you might in some cases have to convince individual judges that that's actually rape. So the status of women, in most cases, a broad-based policy for the AKP has been and continues to be very much patriarchal in keeping with the AKP's political Islamist roots, with one exception. And this is fascinating because anthropologists study this. Women in Turkey that are affiliated with the AKP, Erdogan's own political party, have been very effective political campaigners and vote canvassers. So the AKP, in terms of political organization, is very, very clever and effective in canvassing votes, not just necessarily knocking on door to door a month before elections, as we sometimes are used to hear, right? But since the 1990s, in terms of political strategy, if you think about it, in households where all the males go to work and the only people left at home are women raising children or babies, right? AKP-affiliated women who work for the party, which is actually tagged as the women's branch, which is very interesting in itself. They are the ones who canvass for votes. And the people who do this to preach about Erdogan's policies and government policies are not random women knocking on random doors. The party gets organized down to the level of the apartment building, right? So the person who knocks on your door is the lady 3 flights down who you already know, and she doesn't come into your house for the explicit purpose of sitting down and broadcasting a political message. No, she's your friend. And if it was a man doing that, A, they wouldn't be given access to that house because it's a man, and you can't come into somebody else, your neighbor's house just to sit down and have a chin wag and talk about politics. But women can. And because it's your friend, if you're staying at home, you bring the children along, the children are playing, there's 5 or 6 or 7 of you from the same apartment building, you sit down, have a conversation, you're having food, it's an ordinary day. The TV's on, the music's on, whatever. But and you're not making a secret of the fact that you work for the AKP. They know you, and they ask you questions, or you say, look, the AKP is doing wonderful things downtown. They've opened up a new, course for women for, certain, a new skills course for this, or language course for that. You should go and check it out. Or, language courses for that. Or, Erdogan's doing something very interesting things. Do you want to switch on the TV station to where he's speaking today? They've been doing this for years. And women's empowerment within the AKP as political activists is nothing that's belittled or seen as a second-rate type of operation. It's intricate to the success of the AKP as a movement. Half the voters in Turkey are women. How do you get women to come onto your side as voters? Well, you also make sure that you give them a stake in the game, but it seems counterintuitive and counterproductive to me because the power that the party then you don't vote into power is putting into practices that continuously erode already gained rights, probably half a century ago. So why would you want to work for that? I don't know. I mean, that's where So they're utilized for political expediency and grassroots organization in the AKP's political message. Fascinating books have been written about this, anthropological studies in the late 1990s you could look into if you're interested. I'm not going to touch on the Kurdish issue, not because I don't value it, quite the contrary. It's just we don't have enough time today. I would like to get more questions on the end of, but I would like to just further this train of thought before coming to the conclusion. What you're looking at is, why is the AKP doing this? People are asking, well, is the AKP, why is it such a big letdown? Why is it, having promised so much in augmenting everybody's status and rights in Turkey, why is it going down, doing the opposite? And my answer to that is, it's not a letdown. This is just a return to roots of the political movement that the AKP belongs to. The AKP is part of Turkey's political Islamist movement, which really became a mainstream political movement in the 1960s, right? It's not a political movement which believes in the equality of men and women. It's not a movement which believes in Turkey's continued existence within the Western Hemisphere, the European Union, NATO, as Turkey is a member of, right? The education of the education of women or girls going to school. It's not, these are historically things that the movement, the political Islam movement in Turkey has not championed. It's not. So when people, it's the wrong question to ask, saying, what are we, the one issue which they really pounded and got passed legislatively is the headscarf issue. And I always say to people who are then dissatisfied with AKP, they passed that legislation as a standalone issue. And at that time, in 2010, there were a lot of critics and authors and scholars who said, look, there are a whole broad array of rights issues that need urgent reform and legislation. The status of ethnic minorities in Turkey, which are not recognized as Muslim ethnic identities, i.e. Kurds, Alevis, right, who are not recognized as minorities because they're Muslims. We could talk about those expressional freedoms in Turkey, not just headscarf, but anybody's ability to sort of speak, augment those, press freedoms, academic freedoms. They're urgently waiting issues. And I always said, look, if this is a movement or a party that is sincere in furthering liberal democracy and liberal democratic norms in Turkey, they wouldn't have put up the headscarf issue as a standalone issue. You put together a basket of issues. You pass a huge package of laws which expand all these freedoms. There was not a shortage of criticism. There was not a shortage of suggestions and buy-in from NGOs and civil society organizations and students and ethnic minority groups who actually advocated saying, don't just pass one law, pass the whole package. I think we said no. So my argument there is that the question to ask is, well, what happened is not the right question to ask. As the political movement of Erdogan has grown stronger, what I would suggest is just a return to its natural roots. The less it feels that it has to be accountable to an electorate, and the more it is reined in the seat of power and the reins of power into one hand, the less Erdogan feels the need to pander liberal critics. And second thing to take away from this is what Erdogan's really interested in is not broadening Turkey's liberal democratic structures. They have only furthered issues and areas of quote-unquote freedom in Turkey which they are sensitive about and which they care about, which matters to them. I touched upon the issue of LGBTQ in Turkey. LGBTQ issues in Turkey, there is a sizable community which has flourished in the last 2 decades. The Pride Walk in Istanbul now, access to education. We're not there with political rights yet, unfortunately, in terms of same-sex marriage or anything like that. But nevertheless, there's an awareness of this. But there is no tacit recognition on the part of, tacit or explicit recognition on part of the AKP or Erdogan to even begin to further these issues. The one issue, as I said, was the headscarf issue, which they pushed forward, which is fine. Everybody's happy with that, broadly speaking. But you know, if you talk to women's NGOs in Turkey, you know, the most powerful women's organizations in Turkey, they'll be the first one to say, what about everything else? Or why are you propagating laws that make me lose control of my own body? Doesn't necessarily have to be abortion. Why are you advocating or incentivizing the ability or the requirement for me to leave work? Why is it up to you? Why is it up to the state whether I have a C-section or not? Who are you to ask me that? I mean, I've actually heard at one conference, academic conference in Lisbon 2 years ago, shortly after Gezi protests, there was a bunch of AKP-inclined and sympathizing academics who came from Turkey, and the issue of C-section came up, as well as abortion. And one member of the AKP-inclined academics explicitly stated that nowhere in the UN Charter does it say that women have control of their bodies, that it was not their right to choose for a C-section. And as you might imagine, there was quite a ruckus in that environment. But I was just stunned at the level of how the AKP thinks at this level. And I actually had a chat to the guy at the end, and he goes, there's no international convention on this. They can't decide, you know, it's a life inside of them in terms of whether it's born by a C-section or whatever, that should be up to the states. I was like, wow, okay. And I'll go back to where I started in terms of a culture where we have rights as a notion of given issues. Rights in Turkey are given, have always been provided, not grabbed and taken. In such an environment, is there any surprise that a government such as this, now in power for more than a decade, is able to chip away at those? Because if it's a society that's founded on the principle and establishment of rights being disseminated and given, it's also a society which indicates the fact that there's a significant lack of protest culture. There's not a huge movement of individuals to rise up and actually demand more or the maintenance of what they actually had hitherto. There seems to be a considerable amount of fatalism and lack of proactive action on the part of citizens to basically, really stringently oppose what the AKP is propagating for the future of women. Thank you very much. Yes, ma'am.
I couldn't help but think about, we have a little bit different history, and yet some of these issues always swarm around the issue of religious freedom
Right.
in the United States. So when these rights were given in the 20s and 30s, was there any effort to establish differentiation between the state and religion, per se?
That's a good question, and yes, there was. Turkey, that's something I could have also mentioned. I mean, it's an entire sort of, I have 2 weeks on this in my class in domestic politics of Turkey. Turkey formally disestablished the state and religion in 1924. And there is an institution called the Directorate of Religious Affairs, which actually regulates religion in Turkey. All imams in Turkey are civil servants. You can't just, like here, you can't just build a building and call it a church and then some guy becomes the pastor or preacher. You can't do that in Turkey. Anyone can build a mosque, but if you want an imam, a clergyman to actually staff that, the state will appoint a civil servant who is an imam, and there are regulations which govern that.
But that's not religious freedom
It's
in
not.
terms of how we understand it
No,
in
it's not.
this culture. And again, that's the state kind of dictating, which means that they can use religion.
Yes.
And which they often do.
Yes.
In terms of putting women in their place.
Yes.
And I'm not just talking about Islam, I'm talking about Christianity,
Sure.
I'm talking about Judaism. I mean, they all have that history of
Yeah.
putting women in their place. And so it becomes very, very difficult then if people have a more fatalistic approach to this, for the state and religion to be separate entities.
Sure. I mean, I fully agree with you. Growing up in Turkey, up until the 1980s, 1990s, as a citizen or existing in Turkey as a citizen, depending on where you were, if you, like I said, if you were growing up in the bigger urban areas, growing up, going to school, you know, there wasn't segregation of the sexes. You know, like going to school in Istanbul was like going to school in London. I'm not exaggerating. I mean, it's, you know, issues between girls and boys, the national curriculum in terms of, you know, women in top management positions. You know, if you look at, you know, the women's participation in the workforce in Istanbul and Ankara, I mean, it's anywhere else you see in the developed part of the world. Women have jobs, women have status, women have, you know, access to everything, and that's one side of the coin. But if we were to, you know, take a bus or a plane and go to, you know, very rural parts of Turkey, you know, women might even be afraid to come out of the house, and in the presence of a man, because, you know, there's a lot, you know, there's a very sort of bifurcated existence of a Gemeinschaft and Gesellschaft in all parts of Turkey. It's not essentially, you know, clear cut and say, well, and so the administration of religion and, you know, religious facets in the role of women was very much shoved to one side. Never played a front row seat in terms of determining the role of the sexes in participation and role in society until what I would say very, very recently, as religiously mandated. I mean, sexual discrimination, that's different. That's always existed within the employment sector anyway. But, you know, exclusively as it pertains to religion, that's something much more of a recent phenomenon that's really become visible. You know, religious diktats interpreted by the AKP or the government of Turkey as to where women should. But, you know, if they're in charge of the bureaucracy, the Ministry of Family and Planning, whatever it's called now, you know, you watch commercials on TV about how to breastfeed, and you know, it's in your interest to have more children. Which is, one legal interpretation suggests that's illegal by Turkish law. You can't have the state advocating for having more children because maybe that's what religion says.
Well, and of course, we have the same sorts of issues in rural parts of this country versus
Yeah.
You've got that same sort of
Sure.
thing.
Absolutely, yes. And that's visible here too, yeah. Absolutely.
Could you expand a bit on why there's not much resistance, given the progress that was made, you know, in the...
That's a very good question. That goes to the question of sort of political culture and political protest potential in a country such as Turkey. And I mean, we've studied this forever. I mean, protest and popular uprising in Turkey has never been perceived as legitimate from a great variety of factors, whether it's the state, fear of the state, whether it's actually the cultural norms adopted by the modern state that continued over from the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire never tolerated dissent in any shape or form. There were strong measures to basically quell that. How that's fed into modern Turkey's political culture is also visible, but the state has always been a very powerful entity in being able to quell and crush dissent very, very effectively, and quite often brutally when required to. But also, you know, the state is also accustomed, and citizens are also accustomed to what you might call what I've referred to as sort of, you know, neo-corporatist style of interest management. So if you want something heard and accepted, you have to use the channels of petition. So, you know, labor unions, if you want, you know, collective bargaining agreement rights, or if you want wage increases for your miners, right? You don't just pick up, you don't do what the French do, which is shut down the interstate in France and, you know, chuck all your onions on the thing, right? And that's, you know, the French are a very protest potential culture. And that's where, in Turkey, well, you know, you get together and there's a formal process and you petition the Ministry of Labor, and you have sort of sit down, you have a chinwag, and the state says no to a 3%, and they come back and forwards. And then, you know, it gets pushed up to a higher level, and then you know, the state rules and everybody accepts it. The state is looking to manage interests and interest projection upon the state in terms of demands by intermediaries. Not so much civil society, but, you know, bureaucratic intermediaries. So the Ministry of Labor would have to step in and discuss it with the unions prior to the government saying yes or no. But that's what we've been accustomed to, and that comes from the Ottoman days. The education sort of cultural milieu of Turkey does not encourage political protest. And also, built on top of that, we've had 3 coups d'etats in Turkey since 1960. That has huge toll on popular notions of protest. The only thing I'll say into Turkey's advantage, obviously, which is basically generation, Gen X type stuff, is the Gezi process of 2013. Turkey erupted against the AKP. It's massive street protests. And if you look at some of the interesting work that's coming out on that now, in terms of depending on what the discipline that's being studied in, but one aspect of it is the people who rose up and who were participants in the Gezi protests of Islam of the country. You had one group which was the LGBT group, which came out and were having wonderful sort of marches and flags and making demands and shouting against the AKP, etc., in a peaceful manner. And then standing next to them, you had very, very conservative Muslims who advocated that the AKP was selling out the country and really not sort of, helping to espouse modern practices of Islam. And, they call themselves the anti-capitalist Muslims, right? And they were shouting obscenities at Erdogan, calling him a fag, right? And the LGBT group next to them, one person standing, you'll see this on YouTube, said, don't call him a fag, because we're fags. And then what happens next is the anti-capitalist Muslims sort of have this sort of huddle and think about it, and then they come up with a common slogan. So you start to see a lot of these mix and an amalgamation of differing interests, acceptance, not even toleration, but acceptance of a different viewpoint, empathy, realizing that what unites you against the AKP and Erdogan is more than what divides you. And that has been a very rich cultural learning experience for a whole disparate number of groups who've known only to oppose Erdogan. But that's the glimmer of hope, because Turkey's sort of protest potential seems to be developing amongst the citizen body, but much so, in my generation and below. And that's something that the Turkish government and state, I should say, en masse, is unprepared for. Now, they've been able to brutally crush it so far, and we've all seen that in news. But my analysis of that is always this. They're playing a game, they're playing a game of whack-a-mole. And if you like whack-a-mole at an amusement park as much as I do, it's great. You can carry on going for a while. You may even win sometimes, right? But your arm's going to get tired. And eventually you're going to miss the ball. Something's going to, another one, you're not going to be able to put out everything. This is, in my opinion, where Turkey's at right now. There is an intense amount of disparate number of groups coming out to challenge the government and the state from a number of perspectives, which they've been able to control for a certain number of couple of years now. But this doesn't mean that it's going to continue forever. Past practice doesn't, guarantee future outcomes. Not on social issues like this. So, unless Turkey wishes to establish a North Korea type regime.
Or Syria.
Well, not even that. I mean, Syria was very, Damascus was a very rich melting pot of cultures and religions, to the extent that you don't really see in any other part of the Muslim world again. That was a unique experience too. But okay, Turkey's a pluralist society. I've never said it was a liberal democratic society, but democracy in Turkey has always been a plural one. We have notions of, here, if you talk about the Armenian genocide, it's a very protracted and hideous issue, which is really divisive, and Turks and Armenians hate each other here. I'm not kidding to you. The level of debate in Turkey is much more mature than what we see here. You have books published, you have people discussing in universities and conferences. There's a considerable amount of pluralism in Turkey, which I find that the government will not ultimately be able to squash, that it will just bubble over the top. Because Turkey is not Vladimir Putin's Russia, and it's certainly not North Korea. Limited exposure of democratic freedoms does not mean that Erdogan gets his way. Yes, sir.
Speaking of acceptance and tolerance, you mentioned in this morning's talk what a large number of refugees exist in Turkey, in places like Syria.
Yeah.
And so, can you spend a minute looking at the refugee population there itself as a minority, and can you tell us a little bit about the acceptance by locals of these refugees? It's a long-standing refugee population, I'm told, in terms of things like, refugee bashing, and to what extent the refugees, having been there for so long, are being absorbed, if at all, into mainstream society, getting jobs and stuff.
Thank you. That's very relevant. So Turkey now is hosting close to 3 million refugees, Syrian refugees. It's unprecedented. The government thought that the Syrian civil war would be over within 6 to 12 months. But that's not just Turkey. Everybody thought that, given what happened in Egypt, Tunisia, Libya. And so, it was interested in playing a positive image sort of, and it very much used the refugee issue as an image thing. And also to curry favor with Syrians who would then subsequently go back to their homeland and then be broadly in line with Turkey's preferences for what kind of a regime comes afterwards. And also be a significant player at the table once Assad was to fall. But that hasn't happened. No one ever envisaged that 3 million refugees was going to come. And I said in this morning's talk, you're right, when you have 3 million people in a population of 75, that's no longer a refugee problem, that's a minority issue. And very few of them remain in the camps, the refugee camps that have been established for them, which I have to say, this is the only thing I'll compliment the Erdogan government on. Turkey's refugee housing and facilities granted and provided for the refugees is exemplary. You're not talking about shabby tents in squalid conditions. The accommodation put up and the temporary accommodation put up for refugees is prefabricated buildings with air conditioning and access to clean bathrooms and free from the elements, with good food being provided, and all on Turkey's own dime up until now. That's the only positive thing I'll say about it. But a lot of minorities, a lot of refugees have chosen to essentially move on and seek better refuge in either other parts of the country or elsewhere, as we see on TV going to Europe. Treatment of minorities in Turkey. So there are a few policies that have been enacted. One of them is, instead of classifying refugees, there's now a broad policy now to integrate them by giving them residency, which then allows them to seek work, right? Basically get them off the dole of the state, because it looks like they'll be there for a while. So a lot of them are given temporary residency, which allows them to take up employment and then take advantage of employment benefits as opposed to a better wage, as opposed to sweat labor. Not sure how well that's going. But anyway, at least you get legal status. There's rumors that the government might actually give them citizenship. Erdogan's interested in getting as many voters on his side as possible. I don't know what that would mean. But in terms of how the people feel about it, and this very much falls in line with what most people, refugee-receiving countries, it broadly falls into the pattern of a lot of refugee-receiving countries. It's very, very typical of this. The longer the refugees stay, the more resentment that's breed by the local populations. And that's beginning in Turkey. It's not beginning, it's already there in Turkey. But it's mixed. I mean, Turks are funny people, and it's sometimes your heart will melt. I'll tell you two examples. Sometimes your heart will melt, and sometimes you'll just be saddened. The saddening aspect is obviously, I've seen one instance whereby there was a bunch of Turkish people eating food, and there was a bunch of Syrian beggars outside, and you see a lot of them panhandling and stuff like that, children and all this sort of stuff. And they were saying, oh, look at these gross people, blah, blah, blah. All they do is just, they get all these debit cards so they can get, spend on whatever, on goodies, etc. And they're not really, they're not like living like refugees. They're living better than we are. And the irony obviously was, once they got up and left their food, these kids came and started eating their scraps. And that for me that annoyed me, that sort of mentality. These people are fleeing for their lives, not because it's conducive for them to do so, or because it's a nice holiday to take across the border of Turkey. You upend everything. The stuff that will make your heart melt, though, is you'll see in places like Gaziantep. I mean, I'll give you one instance. This is many. Guy going to work one morning, and this was on a documentary I was watching. A Turkish guy's going to work. He lives in Gaziantep, which is 60 miles north of the Syrian border. Big city there. Had a lot of Syrian refugees. On his way to work, he sees a Syrian family on the side of the street, just, big family, like 6 or 7 people, just sitting there not doing anything. They're hungry, they haven't slept properly, whatever. He takes one look at them and says, okay, instead of going to work, he basically picks them up and leads them back to his house, the basement of which is empty. He puts them up. He doesn't want rent, he doesn't want anything, just, you guys should live here. And then the cameraman says, well, they ask me, why did you do this? And he said, I don't know what else to do. I mean, look at these people, they have nowhere to go. I mean, this basement's just sitting empty here. So, and this isn't an isolated story. So you'll see a mix of this, which I guess is very emblematic. And the only inconsistency of this is, like, Erdogan wallows about, the plight of Palestinians, makes political capital out of this. And a lot of his followers saying, yeah, they're really passionate. They cry about, the Palestinian plight in Gaza and stuff, and that's fine. And I say to these people, well, You don't get the guys at the restaurant who were belittling of Syrian refugees. You think that was going to be any different if you replaced those Syrian refugees with Palestinians? You think they were going to think any differently about them? The hypocrisy, I mean, again, this isn't unique to Turkey. Every refugee receiving country experiences these patterns and movements. It's broad-based resentment over a period of time. But Turkey doesn't fall outside of the typical model, I would say.
One more question from the student.
Over here.
Oh, sorry.
Yes.
So when you were touching upon how the issues with C-section and how you were flabbergasted when he basically said no with state control and stuff, do you think that would ever become more of an international issue if that was publicized, that standpoint? Did you see it
From his
action
perspective?
or anything?
Oh, I don't think so. I think he's just going to do. He plays for this for his own public domestic opinion. I mean, with matters like that, he doesn't care about how internationalized it becomes. The only stuff he uses for internationalization is stuff that wins him more points at home. So, for example, he comes to Washington. He was in Washington last week. With these nuclear security summit talks. And he'll say things like the world is bigger than 5, which refers to the UN permanent members of the UN Security Council. And he says, look at the world, you guys are gross. My country has taken in, at my behest, he says, we've taken in 3 million people. And I'm not going to be facetious about this. I think Turkey is standing on moral high ground here. Turkey has taken in voluntarily 3 million people. The European Union is quibbling over how many thousands it turns away every day. Or, Canada is reveling in the fact that it took 25,000. Turkey, 3 million people. And Erdogan says the world has to be bigger than 5. You can't, this show cannot run how the world is going to be run. It can't be, dictated by 5 countries, a relic from World War II. But, his C-section and stuff like that, that particular policy, I don't know why he bangs on about it. I don't know why he's going down that road. I don't know anything about it to have an informed opinion. I'd like to think it's a medical decision. I don't know if it's, I just don't know. But he's adamant, saying we should outlaw it except in cases of medical emergency. And because he advocated it, the Minister of Health advocated it. But they haven't legalized it yet. No way. Yeah, they haven't legalized it.
I'll say thank you very much.
No, thank you. Thank you for having me. Thank you. Thank you.